this talk, I will talk about my work with Slava Mukhanov and Ali Shamsuddin. And this is our paper on mimetic inflation and self-reproduction. And in this work, we will show a class of inflationary models that tackle the specific problem of self-reproduction and fine-tuning within the framework of mimetic gravity, which is an extension of general relativity. And I organized the talk in three main parts. I think I will stress mostly on presenting the main problems with inflation as a theory and introduce a framework of mimetic gravity so that our model then in this context would sound a bit more understandable. And I hope you will be able to appreciate the power of this model, but only as long as I succeeded explaining a bit on mimetic gravity, or else it would sound like some mathematical nonsense which I wouldn't like to hear. So it might sound a bit strange for people maybe working in observations or on the CMB, in which people mostly deal with inflation models as reduced models, or in terms of the predictions they make for the relevant observables. However, in the theory sector, actually, a lot of self-consistency problems within inflation as a framework are hugely debated and hugely discussed. And hopefully I will be able to outline as many of them as possible. For instance, in this work by Paul Steinhardt and many others, they outline some of the problems with inflation as a theory, and actually they and many others move on to try to explain homogeneity, flatness, isotropy problems within different frameworks that are completely different from inflation. For instance, these authors have put forward a model of ekpyrosis, which is actually a contraction, and then they try to explain these many things within that framework. Therefore, at least in the theory sector, we have to take these problems and challenges to inflation a bit more seriously. And if we are to present a model or any class of models for inflation, we should not stop at getting any good observables that agree with observations, but also kind of try to tackle the internal inconsistencies and challenges that these and other authors present for inflation. So main criticisms targeting inflation as a theory are these listed. The first one is actually the most weak point that addresses that criticizes inflation, which is that there are too many models and most of them give the results that are needed, but I won't go into that very deeply because it's actually less relevant, but I will use it as a chance to say that actually the most simple models in inflation are ones that are ruled out. For instance, national inflation and simple power law inflation, and models that are actually a bit more favored are the ones, at least by the ones that were selected by Planck in 2013 and onwards, are models which are based on a plateau-like potential in the theory. And one of them is, for instance, Higgs inflation, which the main idea here is non-minimal coupling with the Higgs field as a scalar field. And then whenever you transform this action into the physical framework, then you get just a simple inflation with a plateau-like potential, and then you get inflation. But there are some problems with this model, but at least it's one of the mainly discussed models, and it's one of the leading ones to explain the observations. And another relevant one is the Sarabinsky model, which falls actually under the scope of modified gravity models, FR gravity models, where you add just some extra scalar curvature terms into the action. And then again, here you can transform your action into a different frame, and then you will also obtain some scalar field with a relevant potential. And again, in this case, you get a plateau-like potential. And this is one of the also generally accepted or not too criticized models. So these two approaches, non-minimal coupling and modified gravity, it's good to see them as kind of leading models for inflation, because this gives us, with other, of course, motivations from different parts of physics, to say that, okay, modified gravity might be the way for that, and non-minimal coupling also might play a role. So this is very positive, especially for our model, because we will have both elements in what I'll present later. Okay, and going back to the other criticisms. So these three criticisms that are related to the fine-tuning of initial conditions, the likeliness to start inflation and the multiverse and eternal inflation, etc., are kind of could be grouped into the same category. And I will expand a bit more on the multiverse and go into some great detail into describing the problem there. But maybe I can say a bit about the fine-tuning of initial conditions as a problem in inflation. So if you have your scalar field and you have some big patch of space and you want to start inflation, if you start with a slightly non-homogeneous, like an inhomogeneities in this big patch of space, inflation might not start. Inhomogeneities actually pose a problem for inflation to start. So the solution to that is to actually start with a homogeneous field to begin with in this patch, which is a bit problematic because what we're trying to do is end up with a homogeneous isotropic flat patch. But then the condition to obtain that is to start with an inflating field, which is already homogeneous. So you can see how this actually poses a problem. And one way to solve that is to say, okay, maybe we can start with a smaller patch. And for instance, if you start with a Planckian scale patch that you can reasonably take to be homogeneous, you would have only the quantum perturbations within that patch to deal with, and you wouldn't have a big inhomogeneities that would spoil inflation for you. But the problem in this second approach is actually, and I will talk about it in the coming slides, is it leads to the problem of eternal inflation and the multiverse. And this is another problem. And most models, actually, I want to stress that once I convince you that this is actually a problem, most models haven't been able to solve these problems simultaneously. And hopefully in our model, I will show you how we avoid both of these problems. So now I'll move to talk to laying down the framework for the multiverse and why does this also cause a problem for inflation as a theory. Okay. To do that, I first have to put a rough sketch of slow roll inflation because this is relevant for plateau-like potentials that are favored by observation. So we have to talk about that. And here there are very few takeaways from this. So we have a potential with a plateau. The scalar field first rolls from here, and then whenever it reaches this plateau, it starts to slowly roll, and this is when inflation begins. And the equations are actually pretty simple. And for this plateau, actually, we can ignore the second derivative term in this equation, and the equation simplify greatly. And for us to obtain a model with a plateau-like potential in it, we have the potential, if you start with a simple model, gravity and just a scalar field with a potential, then these are the conditions on the potential that you have to satisfy for you to have slow roll condition and the field for it to roll on the plateau leading to inflation. And so once we remove this term from here, and this term is also very, very small because the field is slowly rolling on the plateau, we end up with these very simple equations. And I'm expanding on them here because the only thing I want to take from this is that the field here increases proportional to this term here. So whenever the field is slowly rolling on this plateau, the value of the background field is increasing proportional to this term. So if I take now a small patch in space, which is proportional, say, to the inverse of the Hubble scale, and of course here we are working with Planck units, and I take the background field, which I described earlier, the field is slowly decreasing. If it's slowly rolling on this plateau, it is slowly decreasing in value. However, in this patch, as I said, the most important inhomogeneities are actually the quantum fluctuations, so we have to account for those. So in principle, if I have this background in this patch, there will be the total value of the field in that patch will actually either increase or decrease depending on the quantum fluctuations that are relevant in that patch. And the only ones that are relevant are the ones that have their wavelength sort of comparable to the size of that patch, and any other quantum perturbations that have smaller wavelengths will actually average out and not contribute to the total change of the field in this patch. And if I take a duration of time, say proportional to the inverse of Hubble scale, then this patch will expand. If I enter inflation, it will expand. Not very good. It will expand, and it will give me like 20 more similar patches. And if I want to follow the actual values of how much this classical field decreases in the background, I can insert from the previous slide the value for the phi dot, and this will give me this term, which enters here. And for wavelengths that are for the quantum perturbations that are proportional to this patch size, the amplitude of those will be proportional to h. So if I want my field to keep rolling down and kind of exit inflation and enter into reheating, I have to have the total value for this classical field, for the field in total, decreasing, and I don't want my inhomogeneities to keep pushing the field upwards and pulling this decrease in the field. Therefore, the condition for that would be to have this term bigger than this in absolute value, so that then the quantum perturbations would not keep me in a continuous state of inflation, and then it would cause eternal inflation or self-reproduction, which these patches just multiply infinitely. However, for plateau models, this actually this condition is never satisfied, and it happens to me that if I start my inflation within a Planck-like size for in a Planck-like patch, then I always end up with having eternal inflation and self-reproduction. And then again, this leads me to the other problem, which is if I don't want to start inflation within a Hubble patch, and I want to start it with any arbitrary piece in space, then I end up with needing a high level of fine-tuning for the problem. And then again, it's either one of these, and these are not consecutively solved. I would like to talk a bit more about the multiverse, but it's not a good idea time-wise. But I also want to say that whenever these quantum perturbations just create a jump in the field in some part, they occur randomly in space. And then what I end up with is that in some random places in space, I have a patch that is eternally inflating, and I have different patches of these. And then the boundaries are increasing at the speed of light. So if I'm in this patch, I have no possibility of seeing any other patch. So let alone that this and these I call this is what I call the multiverse. I have no chance of actually observing what is happening in these patches. So this kind of creates a lack of falsifiability for the theory. This undermines inflation if it causes a multiverse as a theory with predictive power and falsifiability. So this is for the problems that I wanted to lay out. Now I would like to put mimetic gravity in its proper framework. And I want to talk about different modifications of gravity, and I hope that I already motivated a bit with the previous works that a modified gravity theory is actually one of the leading theories for leading models for inflation. However, in other models, the way you expand general relativity or you modify it is by adding an additional scalar field, which is adding another additional degree of freedom into your theory. However, the way we do it is that this is not my idea. This idea was initiated in 2013 by Sava Mukhanat and Ali Shamsuddin, in which they expanded general relativity by a rescaling factor, but rescaling gravity in general does not lead to an invariant theory, because if I rescale the metric, I will move from one physical picture to another. So in principle, rescaling is not included in gravity as a covariant transformation. So if I want to expand a bit the scope of transformations on gravity, but I also want to limit it to the same physical picture, then in principle I could constrain this rescaling and then end up with expanding the scope of GR a bit, and therefore expanding the scope of the solutions that we obtain with this rescaling. And the way they do it is that this rescaling is defined as the velocity of some scalar field, which is called later mimetic field, and I will hopefully show you why. And the way this constraint on the rescaling can be implemented in the theory is simply by adding a constraint on this rescaling. So you put it equal to 1 so that the new metric is equal to the old one. And this is all you do at this stage. So if you add another component phi, but then it's constrained, you're left with 10 parameters, the same as in the old theory. So you don't have to invoke any new additional degrees of freedom, or even make this field dynamical, because this is not favorable. And so in our case, this field is non-dynamical. Okay. Okay, so let me emphasize why is this called mimetic field. It's because, so if this is the action that I presented to you, if I just vary with respect to the metric, I obtain modified Einstein equations in which, in the absence of any other backgrounds or matter, I obtain in the 0, 0 equation a term that contributes like this to the energy density, and this looks like a dark matter term, which shows up in the absence of any other fields, just because we expanded slightly the GR in a way to rescale, but in a constrained way. And this is why we call it mimetic dark matter, because this rescaling, the limited rescaling, allows me to have a dark matter component without the presence of anything else. If you want to stop there, you can. However, we build a bit more on the theory, and we're able to build a scalar invariant using this field, which is this contracted second derivative of the field. If I include this in my equation, if I couple this, for instance, to the potential, it can also, in principle, play the role of non-minimal coupling to the potential, just the same way we saw with the Higgs inflation, where it was non-minimally coupled to gravity, although there it was coupled to the curvature as a scalar, and here we only couple it to the extrinsic curvature whenever I choose a synchronous system. And the good thing about this is that I can write it in terms of the mimetic field that I introduced in my theory, so that it is internally consistent. And I have no time to discuss other things, but this is now finally our model. So this is the Lagrangian. This is just gravity. This is the constraint on this mimetic field. This is an inflaton field, and then I add a potential for this inflaton field that I couple to this scalar curvature defined through my mimetic field. And of course, I choose the potential to be a plateau-like potential so that it's consistent with the observations. And of course, I modify and I get the equations, and they're fairly simple, and the modifications are very minimal if you look at the 0, 0 equation and the equation of motion for the inflaton. But I have no time to go through that, and I will just skip through the results. This is my potential. This is the plateau potential that I use, and you can use different ones, but this is the one we use to illustrate our point. And this is our coupling term, and you can see here that the coupling term actually, we only have this coupling effective when we have a high degree of curvature, and whenever the curvature is very small, then you just reduce this case to a simple scalar field in a normal background, only with the mimetic constraint included. And this part here is just for the reheating, so I'm not interested in this. I just want to see how the dynamic of the field evolves in this part. And I have that on the plateau, if I do the same exercise that I showed you before for the self-reproduction and the multiverse, actually see that if I start inflation here, the condition for self-reproduction is always violated, and I don't have any eternal inflation, multiverse, and all of those problems. And in this part, actually, which is contrary to other plateau models, it is dominated by the kinetic term. The condition for self-reproduction is only violated if I start inflation below Planckian scale, which means that if I want to start inflation outside of the plateau, I have to start with the Planckian size space patch, and then I would avoid self-reproduction and avoid a high degree of fine-tuning at the same time. And this is the main result of the paper, and this has not been done in any other works, which is avoiding fine-tuning and avoiding self-reproduction at the same time. I don't have also to go through the cosmological perturbations, but just a few words about those. So the tensor perturbations are the same as in GR, and the scalar perturbations are slightly modified. And what the relevant part to the observations that we have is the spectral index and the tensor to scalar ratio. And for 50 equal, we have the spectral index is 0.97, which is consistent with observations. And the scalar to tensor scalar ratio for this number is actually 0.003. And this is exciting because in many talks that we heard this in this conference, this is going to be in the range of new sensitivities for the detectors, and so this model can be soon either ruled out or favored. But this is also noteworthy to say that this is for the particular potential that we use, but we present like a whole class of these potentials, and which are also worth studying and saying. And this is the spectrum of perturbation. And just to put the conclusions here, and says that we solve at the same time the fine-tuning problem in which we start applying inflation at the Planck scale and avoid self-reproduction. And we have consistent results of observation. And thank you very much for listening.